Every neighborhood has its unspoken rules, the kind that never make it into contracts or HOA handbooks, but are still respected by everyone who values peace and order. For David, one of those rules was simple. His parking spot was his own. It wasn't just a matter of convenience. It was part of his property agreement, clearly marked and meant to make daily life easier. Yet, despite the obvious lines and signage, it didn't take long for him to realize that one particular neighbor had no respect for boundaries at all. It began subtly. The first time Karen parked in David's spot, he thought little of it. Perhaps it was an honest mistake. The parking area was large, the spaces tightly lined, and maybe she had misjudged. But when it happened again the following week, he noticed a pattern. Karen, known throughout the neighborhood for her entitled behavior and constant complaints, had started using his parking space as if it were her own. She wasn't confused, and she wasn't lost. She was simply ignoring the rules, claiming what wasn't hers. David let it go in the beginning, hoping that the problem would resolve itself. After all, confronting Karen was a dangerous game. She had a reputation for turning even the simplest disputes into full-blown wars. Her yard was littered with signs about rules, warnings to strangers, and complaints directed at imaginary enemies. She had stormed HOA meetings, demanded changes to neighborhood bylaws, and made life difficult for anyone unlucky enough to be her target. Still, David thought maybe, just maybe, this was something that would stop if he ignored it. But Karen had no intention of stopping. In fact, her behavior escalated. Before long, she was parking in a spot nearly every day, sometimes leaving her car there overnight. On mornings when David needed to leave early for work, he'd walk outside only to find her vehicle blocking him. The irritation grew with each passing week. What had started as a minor annoyance turned into a daily battle, one that drained his patience and tested his calm. Neighbors began to notice too. A few whispered about it during casual conversations, sympathizing with David but unwilling to get involved. Karen's confrontations had burned enough bridges already, and no one wanted to be her next victim. That left David isolated, forced to fight this battle alone. The HOA was no help either. When he filed a complaint, they promised to send her a warning. Weeks passed, and nothing changed. Karen seemed emboldened, as if the lack of consequences gave her permission to continue. Each evening when David returned home, he felt a surge of frustration as he saw her car in his space. The feeling of being disrespected, of being walked over in his own community, began to fester. He tried parking in other areas, but those spaces belonged to other residents. Every time he took one, he risked becoming the problem himself. And that's exactly how Karen wanted it, forcing him into a position where he either had to confront her or suffer in silence. The breaking point came one Saturday morning. David had planned to run errands early, hoping to get ahead of the weekend traffic. But when he walked out the door, Karen's car was once again sitting smugly in his spot. She wasn't home either. Her house was dark, her blinds drawn. She had gone somewhere and left her car behind, ensuring David was stuck waiting or forced to scramble for another place to leave his vehicle. That morning, as he circled the neighborhood searching for a temporary space, his frustration turned into resolve. Something had to be done. David began researching. He looked into HOA bylaws, local parking laws, and even city ordinances. If the HOA wouldn't enforce their own rules, maybe there was a legal route. But every option seemed to require tedious processes, endless paperwork, or expensive legal battles. Karen knew this too. That's why she kept pushing the boundary. She assumed no one would go through the effort to stop her. But David wasn't ready to give up. The idea of confronting her directly didn't appeal to him. He knew she'd twist the situation and make herself the victim. What he needed was a plan that would teach her a lesson without risking retaliation. Something clever, undeniable, and completely within the rules. And slowly, as he sat in his living room sketching out possibilities, the first sparks of a legendary payback began to form in his mind. The key would be patience. If he struck too soon, she'd find a way to turn it back on him. But if he waited, observed, and executed his plan carefully, she would have no defense. For weeks, he watched her routine. He noted when she parked in his spot, how long she stayed, and how often she disappeared without moving her car. He gathered information the way someone might prepare for a long chess match, knowing that every detail could make or break his strategy. Karen, oblivious to the storm building around her, continued on with her entitled behavior. She waved at neighbors with forced friendliness, then turned around to file complaints about their lawns or trash cans. She strutted through the neighborhood as if she owned it, completely unaware that her arrogance had gone too far. Each time she parked in David's spot, she unknowingly added fuel to the fire of her own downfall. And David? He was ready to light the match. The trap was forming, one detail at a time. He had the motivation, he had the evidence, and soon he would have the perfect opportunity. Karen thought she could steal his space forever, but she was about to learn a harsh lesson. Every action has a consequence, and some consequences are unforgettable. The question wasn't if David would get his revenge. The question was when. And that moment was coming faster than Karen could imagine. David had reached a point where frustration had turned into determination. For months, he had endured the daily insult of finding Karen's car sitting smugly in his parking spot, like a silent taunt daring him to react. But now, his patience had run its course. He wasn't going to complain to the HOA again. He wasn't going to leave another note under her windshield. He wasn't going to waste breath confronting her directly. Karen thrived on conflict, but this time, she wouldn't even see the battle coming. His plan began with observation. If he wanted his revenge to stick, he needed to understand Karen's habits down to the smallest detail. So, for several weeks, he played the role of a quiet detective. He logged the times her car appeared in his spot, how long it stayed, and whether she was home or away during those periods. He noticed patterns. She often parked there when she had guests, as if she wanted to clear her own driveway for them. Other times, she left her car in his space overnight when she traveled out of town, knowing she'd face no real consequences upon return. David also paid close attention to the HOA bylaws and city ordinances. Buried in the fine print of the rules, he discovered several loopholes that could work in his favor. One in particular stood out. Homeowners were responsible for ensuring their vehicles were parked only in designated spaces. Any violations were subject to fines or towing, provided photographic evidence was presented. This was the crack in the armor he needed. Karen had been careless, and now her arrogance had opened a door for him. But David wanted more than just a fine or a warning. He wanted to design something that would embarrass her, something that would make her think twice before ever stepping out of line again. He wanted to set a trap so flawless that even Karen, with all her excuses and dramatics, couldn't weasel her way out of it. The blueprint of his revenge took shape in his mind like a puzzle slowly clicking together. It would involve 3 stages: documentation, setup, and execution. Documentation would ensure that he had undeniable proof of her violations. Setup would involve creating a situation where her behavior would backfire spectacularly. Execution would be the final blow, delivered in a way that was both legal and deeply humiliating. For documentation, David invested in a small security camera. Discreetly mounted to the corner of his house, it had a perfect view of his parking spot. Each time Karen parked there, the camera captured it, date and timestamp included. Within weeks, David had a collection of undeniable evidence. Hours of footage showing Karen's car sitting in his space, sometimes for days at a time. It was more than enough to prove her guilt. Next came the setup. David knew that simply reporting her to the HOA wouldn't make much of an impact. She'd receive a warning, maybe a small fine, and then she'd return to her old habits. No, he needed something sharper, something that would sting her pride and leave her cornered. That's when the idea struck him. He would use her own carelessness to trap her in a situation where she had no escape. He studied the lot carefully, considering how cars moved in and out and where leverage could be applied. If Karen wanted to use his space so badly, perhaps it was time she got a taste of what happened when a space became a trap. The thought amused him, but he wasn't reckless. Whatever he did had to be completely within the rules. The final piece was execution, and for that, David began to gather tools. He purchased brightly colored reflective paint, the kind used for marking curbs and no parking zones. He also found a heavy-duty lockable parking barrier online, the kind businesses use to keep unauthorized vehicles out of private spots. It wasn't cheap, but for David, the cost was worth it. The barrier could be folded down to allow his own car through, then locked upright to block access for anyone else. Installed correctly, it would turn his space into a fortress. But before he set it up, he wanted to make sure Karen walked right into his plan. He decided to wait for a weekend when he knew she'd be hosting guests. Sure enough, within days, he noticed the familiar signs. Extra cars parked around her property, chatter from her backyard, and her driveway mysteriously empty. As expected, Karen moved her own vehicle into David's spot, clearing her driveway for visitors. It was the perfect setup. That night, as her car sat there, David went to work. Under the cover of darkness, he painted crisp, reflective lines across his space, making the reserved marking brighter and more undeniable than ever before. At the head of the space, he installed the foldable parking barrier, locking it upright behind Karen's car. In the morning, she would find herself boxed in, unable to move without first confronting the very evidence of her own wrongdoing. David felt a thrill of satisfaction as he tightened the lock on the barrier. He had stayed within the rules. His space was his own, legally marked, and the barrier was his right to install. The camera recorded every moment, capturing his actions as clean and legitimate. Karen would have no argument, no excuse, and no way out without admitting fault. He returned inside and waited. Hours later, as the first rays of morning sunlight crept across the neighborhood, he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat near the window. The anticipation was electric. He knew Karen's morning routine well, and soon she would come out, ready to use her car. But this time, instead of casually driving away, she'd be trapped in a cage of her own making. For David, it wasn't just about reclaiming his space. It was about reclaiming his dignity. For months, Karen had walked over him, assuming her entitlement would protect her from consequences. But now, the tables had turned. The trap was set, the evidence secured, and the stage prepared for her downfall. As he sipped his coffee and watched the clock tick forward, David felt something he hadn't in months: control. He was no longer the victim in Karen's petty game. He was the architect of her reckoning. And soon, the entire neighborhood would witness the legendary payback that was about to unfold. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carried every sound clearly through the neighborhood. David sat by his window, calm but alert, watching Karen's front door like a hunter waiting for his prey to step into the clearing. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, and now it was finally unfolding. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the door opened. Karen emerged in her usual confident stride, clutching a travel mug and jingling her car keys. Her posture radiated entitlement, as if the world around her existed purely for her convenience. She barely glanced at her driveway, still occupied by her guest cars, and instead headed straight toward David's parking spot, where her car had sat comfortably overnight. The scene was perfect. Her vehicle was boxed in neatly by the freshly painted reflective lines, every marking screaming reserved. And there, locked upright at the head of the space, stood the heavy-duty barrier David had installed just hours earlier. Her car was trapped, perfectly framed in the undeniable evidence of her arrogance. For a brief moment, Karen froze. From David's vantage point, he saw the confusion flicker across her face as she registered the barrier. She walked closer, examining it, tugging at the lock, and stepping back in frustration. Her entitled confidence began to crack as she realized she couldn't move her car. The only way out was to confront the fact that she had parked where she didn't belong. David felt a surge of satisfaction wash over him. The trap had sprung exactly as planned, and now Karen was caught in a public spectacle. Because it wasn't just him watching. Neighbors began to notice the commotion. Curtains twitched open, garage doors rattled, and a few early risers paused on their morning walks. Karen had always relished attention, but now she was getting it in the worst possible way. The neighborhood knew her reputation. They had endured her complaints about lawn decorations, her demands for silence during the day, her endless tirades at HOA meetings. And now, here she was, exposed, trapped in someone else's parking spot with no excuse that could shield her from embarrassment. The whispers began to spread, soft at first but growing as more eyes turned toward the scene. Karen, however, wasn't one to accept defeat gracefully. Instead of acknowledging her mistake, she began gesturing wildly, pointing at the barrier, the paint, and even at David's house. From inside, David remained still, letting the security camera record every frantic movement she made. He knew she would try to spin the situation in her favor, but this time, the evidence was airtight. Minutes passed, and Karen's frustration boiled over. She pulled out her phone, pacing back and forth as she made calls, likely to the HOA, maybe even to the police. David couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. He knew exactly how she operated. When caught, she escalated. But no matter who she called, the truth remained the same. She had parked in a space that wasn't hers, and now she couldn't move her car without admitting fault. The real genius of David's plan was that it didn't rely on confrontation. He didn't need to step outside, raise his voice, or get into a shouting match. All he had to do was let the situation play out while the entire neighborhood watched. The longer Karen remained stuck, the deeper her humiliation would grow. Eventually, a small crowd gathered at a polite distance. Neighbors on their porches, kids whispering to one another, joggers pausing mid-route. Everyone was curious to see how Karen would wriggle out of the trap she had walked into so boldly. For once, her power had evaporated, replaced by a visible vulnerability she couldn't disguise. After what felt like an eternity, a police cruiser rolled into the neighborhood, lights flashing quietly. David's eyebrows lifted. Karen must have made her call sound urgent to get officers out here so quickly. The car stopped near the scene, and two officers stepped out, approaching her with calm professionalism. Karen launched into her explanation immediately, her arms flailing as she pointed to the barrier and then to David's house. David watched from inside as the officers listened, nodded, and then walked around to inspect the space. One bent down to look at the reflective paint, the clearly marked reserved signage, and the lockable barrier. The other jotted notes. Then, after a brief conversation, they turned their attention back to Karen. From her body language, it was clear she wasn't getting the response she wanted. Her gestures grew sharper, her voice louder, her frustration boiling over. Finally, after several minutes, one of the officers motioned toward her car, then to the barrier, then shook his head firmly. Karen's arms dropped in disbelief. The message was obvious. She had no case. She was in the wrong, and there was nothing the police could do to save her from her own mistake. The humiliation was complete. The crowd of neighbors pretended not to stare too openly, but everyone saw it. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood rules, had been caught red-handed breaking one of the clearest rules of all. And this time, she couldn't talk her way out of it. David leaned back in his chair, his coffee now cold, but his spirit warm with victory. The trap had worked flawlessly. Karen was stuck, embarrassed, and powerless. And the best part? This was only the beginning. Because once the HOA received the footage, once the fines started rolling in, and once her reputation sank lower than ever before, she would realize that this wasn't just a small inconvenience. It was a turning point. Karen had stolen his space for months, but now, for the first time, she was the one boxed in, with no exit, no excuse, and no sympathy from the community she had tormented. David knew the next phase was coming soon. The police would leave, the neighbors would disperse, and Karen would stew in her own frustration. But the fallout was only beginning, and the legend of his revenge was just starting to spread. The parking spot had become more than just a piece of asphalt. It had become a stage for justice, a battlefield where arrogance finally met its match. And David was ready for the next move. The morning spectacle had left its mark on the neighborhood. Word spread quickly, carried by whispers, text messages, and hushed conversations at doorsteps. By noon, nearly everyone in the community knew about Karen's humiliation. She had been caught in David's spot, boxed in by his lockable barrier, and forced to face the police in front of curious neighbors. It was the kind of scene that no one forgot easily, especially when it involved the neighborhood's most notorious troublemaker. For David, The aftermath was satisfying. He reviewed the camera footage, stored copies in multiple places, and even considered sending a clip to the HOA immediately. But he decided to wait. Timing mattered, and the longer Karen stewed, the more reckless her next move would be. And if there was one thing he knew about her, it was that she would not take humiliation lying down. Sure enough, by late afternoon, the retaliation began. Karen stormed into the HOA office, demanding a meeting. She accused David of harassment, of targeting her unfairly, of setting a trap to embarrass her. She painted herself as the victim, waving her arms and raising her voice in the same dramatic fashion she had perfected over the years. But this time, her complaints didn't land the way she expected. The HOA board members had already heard whispers from neighbors. Some had even witnessed the incident firsthand. And when David calmly submitted his collection of timestamp footage, showing months of violations leading up to the barrier installation, the narrative shifted entirely. The evidence was undeniable. Karen had been breaking the rules repeatedly. The board had ignored earlier complaints, but now, with video proof in their hands, they had no choice but to act. For the first time, Karen wasn't the accuser, she was the accused. The HOA issued her a formal warning, along with notice of potential fines for each documented violation. David hadn't even needed to press them. The footage spoke louder than any words could. Karen's fury was palpable. The very system she had often weaponized against others was now being used against her. She left the HOA office in a huff, her face red, her fists clenched. Neighbors reported hearing her muttering angrily under her breath as she stomped back home. For someone who thrived on control, losing it so publicly was unbearable. But instead of learning her lesson, Karen doubled down. That evening, David noticed her pacing in her driveway. Phone pressed to her ear. She was making calls, likely to lawyers, possibly to friends she thought could help her salvage her pride. She wanted revenge, and she wanted it quickly. Her first move was petty. The next morning, David found a note slipped under his door. It was scrawled hastily, accusing him of harassment and threatening legal action. It had no signature, but he didn't need one. The handwriting was unmistakably Karen's. He smiled, folded the note neatly, and placed it in his growing file of evidence. Each action she took only added to the case against her. A few days later, she escalated further. David returned home from work to find her standing near his property line, phone in hand, snapping pictures of his yard, his mailbox, even the barrier in his parking spot. She was desperate to find something, anything, that she could report to the HOA or local authorities. Her mission wasn't to win fairly. It was to drag him down with her. But David had anticipated this. His yard was immaculate, his mailbox up to code, his barrier completely legal. Karen's photos captured nothing incriminating, only proof of her own obsession. Neighbors watched her antics with a mix of amusement and annoyance. Some shook their heads, others rolled their eyes, and a few even whispered to David that they were rooting for him. Karen was digging her own hole, and everyone could see it. Still, she wasn't finished. One evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, David caught a glimpse of her trying to tamper with the barrier. She thought no one was watching as she bent down, tugged at the lock, and jiggled the metal frame. But his security camera recorded everything in crisp detail. When she realized she couldn't break it, she kicked the barrier in frustration and stormed off, unaware that her every move had been captured. David uploaded the footage and saved it securely. If Karen thought she could paint him as the aggressor, she was mistaken. The evidence was a shield, and he wielded it with quiet precision. He didn't need to shout or argue. He only needed to let her actions expose her for who she truly was. The tension in the neighborhood thickened. People talked about the feud openly now, some siding with David, others too wary of Karen's wrath to speak up. The atmosphere at HOA meetings shifted too. For once, Karen's voice didn't dominate. When she tried to complain, the board cut her off, reminding her of the violations documented against her. It was a small but significant victory, one that left her visibly shaken. Despite her retaliation, David remained calm. He had no interest in escalating further unless she forced his hand. But deep down, he knew Karen wasn't done. Her pride had been wounded, her image tarnished, and her authority shattered. That kind of person didn't back down quietly. Karen's next move would be desperate, and desperation often led to mistakes. David was ready. He had more paint, more locks, and more cameras if needed. He had patience on his side, and a neighborhood that was slowly but surely turning against her. The legend of his revenge was spreading, not because he boasted, but because people saw the truth for themselves. Karen had stolen his space for months, but now she was the one cornered, trapped in a cycle of her own making. The harder she fought, the deeper she sank, and David knew the endgame was approaching. He wouldn't need to push much further. Karen's own obsession would soon deliver the final blow. By now, the neighborhood had turned into an audience, and Karen was the unwilling star of the show. Every misstep, every tantrum, every failed attempt to regain control only added fuel to the whispers that spread from house to house. For years, she had thrived on her reputation as the enforcer, the one who scolded neighbors and kept everyone in line. But now, that reputation was crumbling, and Karen couldn't handle it. Her retaliation escalated in ways that made her seem less like a neighbor and more like a character spiraling out of control. One morning, David woke to find flyers taped to mailboxes across the street. Each flyer accused him of harassment, claiming he had set a trap to humiliate an innocent homeowner. The text was written in bold capital letters, dripping with Karen's signature dramatic flair. But instead of rallying sympathy, the flyers became a running joke. Neighbors laughed about them during dog walks and morning jogs, some even photographing them to post online. David collected one of the flyers, placed it neatly in his evidence file, and moved on with his day. Karen's attempts to smear his name weren't working. They were only exposing her desperation further. But humiliation alone wasn't enough for Karen. She needed revenge she could feel. So, one evening, she made her boldest move yet. David had parked in his space, barrier locked upright behind his car as usual. Hours later, while reviewing his camera feed, he saw her approaching under the cover of night. She crouched low, glancing around nervously, before pulling a small toolbox from a bag. Her intent was clear. She was going to dismantle the barrier. David watched from inside as she struggled with the lock, jamming a screwdriver into the mechanism and tugging furiously at the bolts. Her face twisted with effort, her movements frantic and sloppy. She wanted to prove she could take back control, but all she was proving was her recklessness. The security camera captured everything in high definition: the tools, the attempt, the damage she was causing. And then, in her frenzy, she slipped. The screwdriver skidded across the barrier, her hand striking the metal frame with a loud clang. The sound echoed down the quiet street, and porch lights flicked on nearby. Karen froze, caught in the spotlight of curious neighbors. She scrambled to gather her tools, but not before several people witnessed her standing in David's space, caught red-handed tampering with property that wasn't hers. The next morning, David sent the footage to the HOA. Within hours, Karen received a formal notice. She was being fined for vandalism and property damage, with the threat of further legal action if her behavior continued. The board couldn't ignore it this time. Too many witnesses had seen the incident, and the video left no room for denial. For Karen, it was the lowest point yet. She had gone from smugly stealing David's space to being branded a vandal in her own community. The humiliation was unbearable. But instead of accepting defeat, she lashed out again, this time more recklessly than ever before. Later that week, she staged a scene. Parking in her own driveway, she placed traffic cones and makeshift, reserved signs near the curb, trying to mimic the legitimacy of David's barrier. She wanted to make it look as though she, too, had authority over spaces that weren't hers. Neighbors rolled their eyes as they passed by, recognizing the stunt for what it was: a sad attempt to claw back control. David didn't interfere. He didn't need to. The HOA quickly ordered her to remove the cones and signs, reminding her that street parking was public and that she had no authority over it. The signs disappeared the next day, leaving behind nothing but the memory of yet another failed attempt. But Karen's final mistake came soon after. Enraged by her mounting failures, she decided to make one last desperate move. She parked her car in David's space again, directly behind his barrier, this time forcing her vehicle halfway in at an angle. It was a sloppy, defiant act, meant to show that she could still do as she pleased. David didn't react immediately. Instead, he let the car sit there, filming it from multiple angles. When Karen returned hours later, she found herself boxed in once more, this time by a tow truck. David had finally called in the city's parking enforcement, armed with months of footage and the HOA's documented violations. The tow truck driver, polite but firm, explained the situation. Her car wasn't just illegally parked, it was subject to removal at her expense. The scene that unfolded was nothing short of legendary. Karen begged, pleaded, and shouted, but the driver was unmoved. Neighbors gathered again, some pretending to check their mail, others openly watching from their porches. When the tow truck lifted her car, Karen's fury boiled over. She stomped her feet, cursed under her breath, and stormed off into her house as the vehicle was carried away. For David, the moment was pure vindication. Months of frustration had culminated in a single act of justice. The trap had sprung again, this time with consequences she couldn't talk her way out of. The car was gone, the fees were hers to pay, and the neighborhood had witnessed every second of her downfall. But even as the crowd dispersed and silence returned, David knew the story wasn't finished. Karen had been humiliated, fined, and now forced to pay for her own defiance. Yet, people like her didn't just disappear quietly. They burned out slowly, leaving a trail of chaos in their wake. The end game was near, and David could feel it. One more push, one final blow, and the saga would close with a lesson Karen would never forget. By the time Karen's car was towed away, her reputation had been reduced to whispers, rolled eyes, and pitying glances. The woman who once strutted around the neighborhood, enforcing imaginary rules, now shuffled through her days under a cloud of humiliation. But even stripped of her influence, Karen still carried that stubborn spark, the belief that she could claw her way back into control if she just tried hard enough. David, however, knew better. He knew the end was coming, and he was prepared to deliver it. The HOA had already issued multiple fines against her, but Karen had ignored every one of them, believing she could outlast the board as she had in the past. What she didn't realize was that David had been quietly feeding the HOA every piece of evidence he collected. The security footage, the vandalism attempts, the parking violations, and even testimonies from neighbors who had grown tired of her antics. Each report stacked neatly on file until it painted a complete picture of her behavior. It wasn't long before the HOA called for a special meeting. Neighbors gathered in the clubhouse, filling rows of chairs as the board members shuffled papers and prepared their case. Karen arrived late, flustered and defiant, her eyes darting around the room as though still expecting allies. But the allies she once had were gone. All that remained were people tired of her chaos. The meeting was brief but brutal. The board laid out her offenses in meticulous detail. Video footage was shown on a projector, each clip highlighting her theft of David's space, her attempts at vandalism, and her nightly confrontations. The gasps and murmurs from the audience told the story. No one could defend her anymore. When it was over, the board delivered their verdict. Karen was being fined thousands of dollars in accumulated penalties, and if she refused to comply, the HOA would pursue legal action. The room fell silent as Karen stood frozen in disbelief. For years, she had been the one dishing out threats and warnings, but now the tables had turned entirely. Her reign was over, and everyone knew it. David didn't smile or gloat. He sat quietly, hands folded, watching as justice took its course. This wasn't about petty revenge anymore. It was about restoring balance to a community that had suffered under one person's obsession with control. Still, he couldn't deny a quiet satisfaction in knowing his patience and planning had paid off. In the weeks that followed, Karen's defiance melted into resignation. The fines hit hard, the tow fees stung even worse, and the stares from neighbors she once intimidated cut deepest of all. She stopped parking in David's spot, stopped patrolling the neighborhood with her camera phone, and eventually stopped appearing outside altogether. Her blinds remained drawn, her driveway empty. For the first time in years, peace returned to the block. David's barrier still stood proudly in his space, its bright yellow frame a quiet reminder of the battle that had taken place. Every time he parked his car, locked the post in a place, and walked back into his house, he felt the weight of a small but meaningful victory. It wasn't about a parking spot anymore. It was about standing firm against someone who believed the rules never applied to her. The story of Karen's downfall spread beyond the neighborhood. Friends told friends, neighbors shared online, and soon, David's legendary revenge became a tale others repeated in laughter and disbelief. The guy who set the trap, they called him, the one who finally stopped Karen. It was a title he wore with quiet pride. As summer turned to autumn, the neighborhood thrived again. Families gathered for block parties, kids played freely in driveways, and the air no longer carried the tension of Karen's watchful presence. The parking space remained David's, undisturbed and respected, a symbol of what could happen when patience, planning, and a little creativity turned the tables. And Karen? She faded into the background, her once booming voice reduced to silence. The woman who thought she could control everyone around her had been undone by the simplest of things: a barrier, a camera, and the determination of one man unwilling to be pushed around. In the end, the lesson was clear. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it isn't cruel. Sometimes it's just smart, measured, and delivered in a way that leaves no room for retaliation. For David, that was enough. His space was his again, his peace restored, and his victory secured. The payback had been legendary, and the neighborhood would never forget it.